Story 5. They like to play games, 9:45 p.m. I'd never been inside of one before. An awkward, out-of-place feeling little room nuzzled between a failing Irish pub and an antiques shop. I'd honestly forgotten these things existed in the vast metro area of my city until I needed one. College essay, and I hadn't even begun it. Just my luck for my laptop to obnoxiously die the weekend before the paper was due. I tried to borrow a friend's computer, but no dice. As for Plan B, my school's library was out of rentable laptops. To the local CD internet cafe I went then, where I had always been told the poverty-stricken perverse surfed for porn, and the seemingly parentless children crowded around online games. The place smelled like a Chuck E. Cheese. It was already dark, and I was just going to take the subway back when I had put some decent work in. But the ugly pang of hesitation sunk into my stomach, looking into the depressing place. God, did I not want to sit here and do work on a Friday night? Not only was it dingy and torn right out of 2005, but it was in a part of town I did not want to be at this hour, and since it was open until midnight, I really had no excuse to leave early. I wasn't about to risk failing another class, even for the sole reason that my mom would have ripped into me again. I groaned as I stepped through the threshold. At least it was empty. Well, almost empty. Some plain-looking guy was sat at a computer in the leftmost row, but he looked so absorbed with his screen he didn't even notice me walk in. I took a seat at the very back, slung my backpack off, whipped out an external hard drive and set to work. 11:20 p.m. Looking up and down the screen in front of me, I noticed how far I'd managed to come. I had been typing feverishly and cautiously in a sort of trance with zero regard to my surroundings, and words filled the page. I had written no Pulitzer, but before me were two full paragraphs, and a poor excuse for an outline for the latter three. It was something. And the more I finished tonight, the less time I had to spend in this fucking place tomorrow, or even Sunday. I lay back in my chair and gazed absently at the ceiling. My chair was squeaky, punctuating the silence in an ugly way. The light above my head was dim. In fact, all the ceiling lights seemed to burn pretty low. I would have been creeped out if I were a more easily spooked person. But I'm not. I'm relatively built. I'm a skeptic, and I don't have that vivid of an imagination in the first place. So instead I was just bored. My urge to procrastinate got the best of me, and soon I found myself wandering up and down the dozen or so aisles of outdated white computers that I'm honestly surprised didn't still run Windows 95 just XP instead. There was nobody around, not even that guy who was here an hour ago. I noticed his empty seat before I picked up on the lack of typing and clicking. After a couple of laps around the cafe, I decided to glance down the aisle the man had been in. I noticed a faint glow against the wall that comprised the space behind that row of computers, and I'm a curious person on the border of nosy. I didn't expect to find anything except the Windows startup screen of a monitor yet to go to sleep, but I turned the corner, and you can imagine my surprise when I find a laptop there, a new one. A really nice HP Spectre in great condition, and my first thought was why a guy with such a good computer needed to go to an internet cafe. At closer glance, I could tell the laptop was actually thicker than normal, as if encapsulated in some sort of casing. The screen was open to its desktop with a solid gray background that gave nothing away, and about 20 different folders and icons scattered about. I didn't recognize any of them aside from the basic file. No Internet Explorer, no Chrome, not even an Adobe Reader, just a bunch of weird symbols, some with no English lettering. I really wish I knew more about software. The tabs were minimized on the bottom of the screen, a simple text box, and another that just had a square with a perforated outline. I hesitated. Standing back up, I looked over to my side of the cafe. There was my bright screen open to the blinding white of a Word document, my backpack beside the chair, my water bottle, my phone. It would have been so easy to leave this stranger's private computer where it was and ignore my pestering curiosity and propensity for poor decision-making. Glancing back at the foreign desktop before me, I stood for a moment, weighing the consequences. After a pause, I muttered to myself, "Not worth it." I walked away, and a woman spoke. "Hello? Did someone say something?" Freezing in place. For an instant I thought I must have imagined this sound, but barely a few seconds later, the same shrill, small, canned-sounding voice called out, "Please talk to me." She cried out very clearly, and I realized the woman sounded terribly afraid. I tilted the stranger's laptop screen a little straighter and looked at the minimized tabs. The text box I left alone, the mysterious one I opened. It was using some browser I didn't recognize called Tor, and yet for some reason it seemed familiar. Several tabs were open on it, and I clicked through them systematically. One held a mysterious string of hyperlinks set against a blank background. Another one was in what I think was Cyrillic and had random images of people's faces. A third was just lists of unfamiliar names organized into 3 lengthy columns. With a shock, I opened the last tab to what disturbed me the most. What filled the screen before me was a very dark, fuzzy image of a tiny enclosure, windowless and bare of carpet or furniture. A frail young woman was sitting in a heap in the center of the room with crude-looking chains roping her hard to the ground. And then the woman moved. Her head swung wildly around, her matted hair sweeping the shoulders. She was pale, weak-looking, and very obviously frightened, but otherwise appeared unharmed. She moved like an abused animal backed into a corner, and I spoke back to her without really thinking. "Hi, who are you?" The woman snapped her head to the camera, which must have been the location of my voice. In a panic, I looked for a webcam on the laptop, which I saw had been taped over with black adhesive. After staring at the camera for a while, me gazing on in a confused stupor, she began to sob uncontrollably. She begged me desperately to help her, to let her out, to call the police. In one thin stream of rambling messiness, I tried to form a coherent reply amidst her cries, but I honestly was too shocked to say anything. And before I could, a large man in dark clothing swiftly entered the woman's enclosure and, without hesitation, began savagely beating her with his fists and feet. I slammed the laptop shut. Adrenaline was coursing through me. Cursing myself, I carried it over to my backpack, stuffed it inside, saved my essay to my USB, and left the cafe. 11:55 p.m. I don't really know why I took it with me. I've always been impulsive, and maybe that inner desire to investigate took hold of my senses. Maybe instead it was just an instinct to help somebody in need. Sitting in the soft light of a coffee shop deeper in the city, the computer perched menacingly on the little table in front of me. I thought about what I was going to do when I opened it up. I glanced to my right and looked at my phone. The emergency number already typed. I was terrified and yet excited in some twisted way, an excitement which blinded my common sense. Despite feeling very out of place in the midst of something that seemed much more intimidating than I decided at last to open it again. Really, I expected a password screen and a dead end, maybe hoping for it, too. But the black desktop encouraged me to simply press enter, which I did. And there was the woman. She was splayed awkwardly across the floor, breathing deeply, and every inhale seemed to hurt. Given the mediocre streaming quality, I couldn't make out individual injuries, but she clearly appeared worse than when I'd first seen her. With a sick feeling, I realized her left elbow and wrist were bent in an extremely unnatural way. I plugged my headphones into the jack and spoke to her, getting right to business. What happened to you and where are you? I'm in the south part of the city. I'm Alex. I'm just a college kid. I noticed how shaky my voice sounded just then. What should I do? She jerked her head towards me, but didn't say anything for a moment. Call the police, she whimpered in a low voice. Glancing around herself, the woman looked more helpless than ever now. I don't know where I am. Without breaking eye contact with the screen, I reached for my phone and dialed the number. My heart was pounding again. The call rang for a while, and I had completely blocked out my surroundings. My thoughts were racing, and I tried to piece together what I was going to say, but I found it hard to concentrate. The image of the woman being beaten burned into my mind's eye. I had no idea what the hell I had gotten myself into, and I began to think about tossing the laptop and jumping ship. But then something strange happened. A voice answered the other end, that it didn't ask me what the emergency was. Instead, it spoke in a very AI-sounding tone, a simple hello. In a hurry, I began to rattle off what I had encountered, but quickly was interrupted with the same hello in the same monotone, robotic voice. I paused and waited. Hello, Alex. The text, Alex. A numbing dread creeped into my stomach. I pulled the phone from my face. The number did not read 911, but some random string of digits with an unfamiliar area code. I hung up in horror. Deliberately typing out 911 this time, I pressed call, but found as the dial began to play that the same strange phone number blared across the screen. My phone dropped into my lap, and I yelled. The lone barista, the only other occupant of the shop, looked curiously in my direction. And then I remembered the downsized text box on the laptop. Slowly, deliberately, I moved the cursor to the icon. I hate to admit how afraid I was by this point, but my fingers were literally trembling against the trackpad. I clicked. It was just an address. Nothing more, nothing less. As I stared at the words and numbers before me, the woman began to wail quietly into my earbuds, questioning my sudden silence, begging me to help her, painful-sounding sobs choking her words. They know who I am, I kept thinking to myself, ignoring the girl. How do they know who I am? I desperately racked my brain for how my phone would have been manipulated and my identity revealed. If this was the dark parts of the internet I had heard about, and it really seemed like it, I was probably dealing with very serious computer hackers. I'd never felt so vulnerable. It was all too much. This discovery so much bigger than myself. And I was way over my head. So I picked up my stuff in a panic and ran, leaving the laptop. Before I exited the shop, however, I did go up to the barista and ask him to use his phone or any phone. The large man smiled blankly at me, even looked a little sad, and told me no phones, and rushing out the door without questioning him. I only later realized that that man had not been behind the counter just moments before I approached him, that the barista who had turned towards my yell had been somebody entirely different, and that the one who had denied me a phone call seemed far too old, too foreign, and too out of place to work at this coffee shop. I was in such a frenzy, it didn't even register to me that he had no uniform. 1:37 a.m. Fuck. The laptop was sitting in front of me. I can't believe I didn't notice the guy place it. I took a long and unusual route to a more distant station because I was afraid of being followed. I put my phone away after every text and call I tried to make to my parents wouldn't go through, and I watched my back carefully while I was on the move. But as I sat nervously on the subway, which now was completely and suspiciously devoid of people, the drunk man had slipped it right in front of me without me noticing. It must have been him, the typical loony subway lurker, dressed like a homeless hippie from the 60s and rambling incoherently into his brown paper bag. Was the only other person in that car with me, and he had just gotten off, and the laptop had just appeared in the seat in front of me. Fuck. Adrenaline was coursing through me again, and I angrily flipped it open. There wasn't even Wi-Fi on this subway, but the stream was still steady, and the woman, having been without my company for a while now, looked much worse. Some of her hair looked like it had been torn out in chunks. Clusters of it littered the ground around her. Unmistakable blood dripped in thin streams down her face and torso, and her spaghetti-strap top was stained dark. Both of her feet were missing. It wasn't an illusion. They had clearly been removed directly above the ankle. It took me a moment to notice that the pale extremities had been carelessly thrown to the ground behind her broken body. I gasped and found myself crying silently, feeling more helpless and torn than ever before. She heard me. Weakly, she tried to lift herself to her one working limb, squirming in pain, and managing to ask again for my help. Nobody had ever sounded so pitiful. "I'm going to try," I lied to her in a trembling voice, wishing I hadn't opened the laptop. Before I shut the screen again, however, I pulled the text box back open. Perhaps morbid curiosity got the best of me. It always does. And, to my horror, despite my unwillingness to accept it could be, the text had changed. Beneath the address it now read, "You are stuck, Alex," and then the subway train screeched to a stop. I knew immediately something wasn't right. The emptiness of my car had begun to frighten me immensely, and we were definitely not at my station. Too much time passed before the train doors opened, and I cautiously stepped out of them, leaving the computer in my seat with the girl's growing wails echoing around the room. I did not know where I was. It seemed like a typical downtown subway station, but at the same time there were no signs to indicate where I was, and even the maps of the system had been removed from the underground walls. It was half as lit as it should have been, making this nightmare almost comically dark. The whole place felt abandoned. Glancing around, I tried to think about how long I had been traveling, how far I might have come, but I couldn't for the life of me remember. I cursed loudly at myself and tried not to panic, despite feeling very alone and out of my element, which had been the case since quitting on my stupid fucking essay. The subway train hadn't left yet. The doors were still agape, and silence filled the air save for low cries from the computer. I decided to just ascend the steps and take it from there. I was bound to recognize something, but I didn't. In fact, standing on the empty corner of a city street I had never heard of before, I realized I was in a part of town that seemed completely devoid of all life. The buildings around me were vacant and littered with broken windows, and all the nearest entryways were boarded up. I started walking towards the nearest street lamp, taking in the industrial feel to the area, and noting how little sound I could hear. Adrenaline still pumping, I felt as though an attack could happen at any moment. With a jolt, I stopped and stared at the aging warehouse across the street. The address painted across its metal doors was identical to the one on the laptop. At least I thought it was, but I had no way to check without the computer itself. I wasn't about to make sure, but in this moment I felt very toyed with. The gravity of how out of control this situation had gotten truly registering in my mind. I was rooted to the spot, maybe 100 yards from the subway station, staring into the warehouse and wondering hopelessly what was inside, and knowing I wouldn't dare to approach it. At the same time, some noise was barely audible in the wind around me, something deeply unsettling. My attention refocused. I strained my ears to pick it up. A few steps closer to the street and it hit me, screaming. The girls screaming, not from any device in front of me in the building. I ran. Guilty as I may feel for the rest of my life, I bolted like my life depended on it. To be honest, it probably did. I'm typing this in an alleyway now. I have no idea how far I've come. The only people I've encountered outside have paid no mind to me, but a couple times I'm certain somebody was watching me from down the street. I only stole glances before continuing to run. I just want to get home and put everything behind me. I'm never going to mess with other people's shit again. I'm going to call my mom and tell her I want to come home for a little while, and then I'm going to ace my classes and move on. I am also planning on completely discarding my devices and getting a new phone and computer. God, I hope this doesn't follow me. The street I'm approaching seems familiar. I might be able to make it back soon. 4:05 a.m. I'm so stupid. I'm so naive, so impulsive, and so stupid. It took forever, but I finally made it back to civilization and to my apartment building. I told the guy at the front to call the police, but when he asked me why, I blanked. There was nothing about my story that sounded believable, and what's more, I was afraid to be tied to the event in any way. I had nothing to give the cops anyways aside from some vague details about a laptop and an address I'd already forgotten. So I hurried up to my room, while the man at the front watched me expressionlessly. And now I am sitting in my bedroom, and that laptop is right beside me. Nothing seemed out of place. My front door opened fine and was still locked. No windows or lights had been tampered with, and yet placed delicately on top of my pillows, screen opened, was that goddamned fucking computer. I couldn't believe it. Hell, I desperately didn't want to, but yet there it was, undeniably. My body was instantly wrought with mind-bending horror as reality sunk in and survival mode overtook me. The woman was moaning non-stop now. Her eyes had been brutally gouged out, and I had vomited in fear and shock at the sight of her in my own home. I didn't open the text box, but I am sure there was more to read. I'm typing this out because my texts won't deliver to anybody. My calls won't go through even to the police, and my one outdated landline is doing nothing but beeping dial tones. I'm typing because I'm terrified for my life, and I think I'm trapped here. I don't know what will happen next, but I know it can't be good. Just now I heard something heavy drag across my living room, and there is definitely somebody outside this door. I tried screaming for help out the window, but I'm so high up, and none of my neighbors have done anything if they can hear me at all. I hate myself. I hate how compulsive and nosy I am. I hate that I had to be so bad at college and so unlucky that I ended up in this whole mess in the first place. I hate how fucked I am. The last thing the woman said to me before I tore the laptop battery out was a choked warning. Something that chilled me to my very core. They like to play games, she had sobbed to me before the large man returned abruptly and began to work on her mouth with a pair of scissors. The computer hasn't done anything since then. I was sure to smash the screen with the bottom of my lamp. Somebody is turning the doorknob to my room now. The tiny lock on it isn't going to be enough. And if they want me this badly, the dresser in front of it won't do much either. I think my life might be in danger. Story 6, The Tracks to Nowhere. Have you heard about the tracks to nowhere? That's what George Lovely asked me that morning at school over our brightly colored, sugary cereals. I replied that I hadn't, allowing him to proceed with his story that we didn't believe. If we had known that he was going to prove himself about that old-timer's tale, Danny and I would have had faith in him. They made me go in first. I didn't like the idea at all and was already half scared to death from the outside. Why would the inside be any different? The excuse "you're older than us, so why don't you go first?" was as pathetic as the expressions on their faces back then. If I had known after the fact that only 3 of us would enter to make it out alive, and 1 would make it to graduate high school, I would have pussied out and walked back home. The outside of the house, I might add, was ridden with overgrown grass above our waist and littered with pathways made of stepping stones. There was a barn out in the distance that looked like it was going to collapse any minute. As for the house itself, there were windows chipped and caked in dirt. A broken chair with grayed bits of white wicker sat on the far left of the porch. Taking in a deep breath, I closed my eyes. Something was off. This place wasn't supposed to exist. My feet moved before my body did. The door, hanging off the hinges of the chipped frame, swayed behind me, giving me glimpses of the guys' faces as I walked further into the first hallway. To my left was a kitchen, one window open and curtains flying inward. Under the curtain was a wooden table with plates and bowls stacked high, grimy, and used in the years behind, but never clean and put away. Cups, bottles, and even a newspaper littered the small table as well, like a family had sat down for 1,000,000 breakfasts and forgot to tidy up afterwards each time. The counters, stove, and whatever else hid under the layers of filth were the same a few feet away. The whole thing seemed so unreal to me. My nostrils flared and retracted at the putrid smell that protruded from the kitchen, causing me to gag. I hadn't eaten much that day, which resulted in nothing more than dry heaving and bits of bile running up my throat. Disgusted and swallowing the acid in my mouth, I turned my head to my right, coming in contact with the entrance to a living room that seemed to be in a similar disorder as the kitchen. Only things were perfectly in place. Knickknacks sat on their antique cherry shelves under a blanket of dust and debris through years of no interaction with people to admire them, lonely feeling in their inanimate spirits of porcelain and milk glass. A couch sat under the window where I could just barely make out George and Danny's faces through the dirt on the outside. I weakly waved to them. They didn't wave back. The rest of the living room was occupied by an old television, the ones with the turndials and thick antennas, and a few pieces of sitting furniture opposite to the couch. A chair was angled towards the television, as if someone were once viewing what had been on previously. They left and never came back. The cushion sunken down in the rear, with a ratty blanket covering over the slanting top. I thought about walking in, but before I could tell myself no, I was already there, standing in front of the bulging screen with my reflection staring back at me. Aged aromas wafted by, different from the ones that were in the kitchen. It reminded me of flowers on a wet spring afternoon. Instantly, my worries were soothed for a few moments. The smell then disappeared and turned into weights. The boards underneath my feet screamed out with age as I took more and more steps into the abandoned house. My spine seemed to tremble when my lungs seized with each breath of the heavy atmosphere that smelled of water damage and old socks. I recall wanting to run back out and take heaving breaths of the fresh air that my friends had been breathing at the time, probably not thinking of the luxury while I was getting poisoned by black mold. 2 more steps. I was afraid of looking into the next room. Something in the hallway told me not to, and something in my heart broke off and fell down to my toes with the mass of an elephant for me to keep still. My mind went at it again to move my legs. I cursed myself with utmost stupidity. My thoughts were keeping me company, not in a good way either. Hey, one of the things in my head said, "Don't go." Another told me. I ignored them both because something else was pulling me. George and Danny were farther away from me now, so far that I could no longer hear them call my name or guess at where they were on the porch from the intensity of the screeching porch supports even. Though the door was open yards behind me, I froze, not sure of what to do or where to go with the game of tug-of-war between the growing abyss and the outside world that was in session. Another few steps, the end of the hallway was in sight, but I quickly realized by just closing my right eye that there was a turn in the same direction. Lights shined from that area, but I truly had no interest in finding out where from. The abyss pulled me closer. My foot was about to stretch out in front of me when the bed of the house groaned beyond my back. My heart stopped, my eyes widened, I couldn't move. Something was behind me, stalking me. I wanted to know what, but at the same time, I didn't. By the time my heart started up again, it was already going 100 miles an hour, pulsating in my chest. Blood rushed straight to my head, and I immediately felt the pang of dizziness buried behind my eyes that had a liquid sheen of terror over them. I was about to bolt into the turn with everything I had to try and get away, but whatever had been watching me suddenly lurched forward and attacked me from behind, grabbing onto my chest and pulling itself up on my back with a roaring sound booming into my ears. I felt nails dig into my skin, and the weight began to disappear as quickly as it came. I whirled around, my eyes shut tight as I prayed more than I ever had with one of those kiddie prayers from our church's Sunday school. To my surprise, what I thought was a growling monster with long, sharp claws was actually, I opened my eyes when I heard a laugh, rage taking over my awareness, and immediately bellowing out like the wind from a tornado. George, you Judas tits-a-sucking F.R. freak, was what came out through balled-up fists and clenched teeth. I tried not to stutter my words, but I was just so angry with him that I couldn't help it. I wanted to jump at him like he had done to me, only I would have my way and shove my fists repeatedly into his smug little shit-eating mouth until he was toothless and bloody. I stared at him as he clutched his sides in fits of laughter, leaning against the wall that led into the living room area, now one hand on the wall and one hand at his side. He mustered up the courage between gasps for hair to look me straight in my face and say, "Man, that sure was hilarious." My nose crinkled in anger, and my nails involuntarily dug into my palms. I felt the half-moons form out of my temper before releasing my grip, letting my hands gain back their color. Yeah, maybe for you, you little. Is laughter a peculiar, high-pitched nose like a mixture of nails on a chalkboard and Woody the Woodpecker's cackle echoed down the hall. You should have seen yourself. Jake, I thought you were going to. I told him not to. I swear on it. Man. Danny was in the house now by the door. It slapped shut behind him in the wind that rolled by, making us all jump out of our skin. Even George stopped laughing and jumped at the sudden THWAP when it hit the door frame. The house was unusually silent by then, only responding an unsettling white house. I looked down to George, who was trying to regain his composure from practically humiliating me. Still wanting to kick him, I had to retract my feelings and move on with it, something I wasn't quite fond of at the time. Screw you guys, ... I'm going home, I said, pushing past my friends and trying to get out of the front door. Jake, don't. That was Danny, begging in his whiny voice. Hey, man, come on, don't do this, he yelled. George didn't mean it. But I didn't stop. I kept going until I reached the beginning of the hallway. Then Danny called again in a louder voice than before. George didn't mean it. Nevertheless, I forgave him, and that short 5 minutes, which felt like forever, that we were standing between the kitchen and the living room, feeding off of our own fury and embarrassments. Truly, George hadn't meant to scare me, but he did out of convenience. That was his thing and choice of meals due to his vast ego. Convenience. If that accusation was otherwise, the kid took it to his grave hours after that. Both Danny and George had discovered the remnants of the inside of the house and were just as sickened, if not more, about the disarray of the kitchen and living room. There was some talk about destroying it all and taking what was deemed interesting. I quickly set that notion straight and exterminated their reckless idea, telling them that it wouldn't be a good thing to do. George ignored me and went straight in the living room for the knick-knack shelves to disturb the sleeping collections. He kicked a small box across the matted, maroon-tinted carpet as he eyed the filthy shelves, finally reaching out towards one that even I had noticed was quite beautiful. A pair of baby shoes. They weren't made of fabric or material for wearing, but frozen in time under a sheet of copper, which was popular to do for mementos. I examined the bronzed item before George's grabbing hands took them out of sight. The bottom of the plaque that the tiny shoes rested on appeared to have a name on it, but I didn't have time to read it. Setting the item back down, my friend looked around at the rest of the room that I was already familiar with. Danny didn't find the place amusing and had strolled back into the hallway. I left George in the living room and followed my not-so-destructive friend. I caught up with him just as he turned down the end and became illuminated with the sunlight I'd noticed earlier. "Danny, wait up," I whispered, careful not to alert George. Danny, stopping beside a window that looked like the rest of the house, squinted in the brightness and replied, "George is such a loser." I agreed, but instantly scolded myself for it. I had loved George, but didn't truly know if he loved me back like friends should. He always picked at Danny and I, calling us Boosies and Queers like those were our middle names. I never enjoyed his constant taunting until he came to school on Mondays and hardly spoke like he'd endured some tragic nightmare for 2 days. Then I forgave it all and felt bad for him. It was a subject none of us ever spoke about. He had had bruises on him sometimes and cuts on his lips or above his nose, but never told us why. He always left it at all. I fell down the stairs or my brother and I were playing too rough. His brother was for years old and not potty trained. Before us was a long, straight staircase. The steps were white and in distress, but begging for someone to walk up them. My shadow, elongated by the sun's rays, stretched onto the wall of the second floor. It mocked me. Danny's shadow did the same. "Wanna go up?" he asked. I nodded, but only in apprehension. The rail was cold and weak when I touched it, but I took the first few steps anyway. Danny started behind me, his breath beginning to shake. The air changed again. The aroma of flowers was back and it hit me like a train, invading my nose and making my eyes water. "Is that?" I said. "Yeah, I don't know where it's coming from, but it's weird." Danny thought so too, and continued walking again. At the top of the stairs was another narrow hallway that was lined with doors and peeling paint that started at the ceiling and grew down like vines, zigzagging in different patterns. I didn't know why I was so scared. It was just an old house that couldn't do anything to us if it wanted to, because, like I said, it was just a house. Houses can't grow arms and legs and rip your head off or open your rib cage, eat your heart out while you're still alive. Can they? No was the logical answer. Yes was the one for a sub-question about what the inhabitants of the house could do. I had not taken any more steps into the upstairs at the time. I was too busy straining my ears to listen for movement or breathing that wasn't our own, and while I didn't hear either of those, I did happen to hear music. Light, country-sounding, static-ridden music, like the kind that you hear when a record player gets a hold of an old-timey tune. The singer's voice was strained over a guitar with little to no tuning, but it was still music, unsettling in its quietness, that was coming from behind one of the doors. At first we thought George was just messing with us from downstairs, but we soon walked farther and found that, with each step, the music grew louder, until it was vibrating our eardrums into suffering. I looked at Danny. Danny looked at me. We were both thinking the same thing, yet we didn't back down. "Should we split up and find out where it's coming from?" he asked. "That was a bad idea, I guess," so I said. One set of rooms at a time, okay. You get the one on the right, and I'll get the one on the left. I thought, don't go. I did anyway, turning into the room on the left. The door was slightly stuck, but I gripped the glass handle just right and forced it towards the rest of the hallway until it gave way and I fell in. Danny hesitated on the other side when I glanced back at him with assuring eyes. Danny entering the other room, I opened the door to mine and carefully walked in. I had never thought about the possibility of falling through the floor and landing in that horrid kitchen until I felt the surface slightly bow under. My next step was tentative, delicate in the terms of my normal, frantic movements, like my head had been cut off. Fear, that's all I felt. The crippling, stomach-eating venom surged through my veins and struck my heart. I didn't know what was happening for that short period of time, but I soon began to understand that it was all real. Everything that I'd seen for the past hour or so was real, and it was batting at me like a baby would to a mobile swinging above its crib, whacking until it finally had me in its grasp. Suddenly, a thought crept into my mind and nested itself into my brain. I hadn't thought about it so long that I had almost forgotten about it at the time when I did think about it. The picture was there for good, basking in its glory of horrific depictions that no child should ever have to see. In front of me, the picture came to life. It was the picture that had haunted me at night when my cousins and I would stay at my grandparents' house for a few days during the summer, leaving me soaked in my own urine many times. The photograph was an odd one, I'll tell you that. A post-mortem taken at the funeral of the person who sat in the coffin of black and white. The person happened to my grandmother's late sister who died at the age of 9. I can still see it if I want to. The first thing I saw happen to be her hand, her cold, dead, pale hand that was just barely touching the floorboards under the chair that she was limply propped up in. Her fingernails were gray, drained of all color that they'd had when she was alive. Attached to that hand was her arm, oddly rested and hanging off of her body as if she didn't have the strength to control it. Of course she didn't. She was dead. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. Yards away, Danny was experiencing the same thing, only something from his nightmares that he never spoke much about. I envied George, who was still downstairs. That arm started to twitch. It started out like a simple breath, faint and unwavering at first before it turned into a heave of gasp, a beg that filled the entire room before that arm jerked and tossed itself an inch or two above the floor. Another arm moved, then a leg, another leg, then a torso. It was a girl that arm was attached to, dead and gone from decades. Hey, don't go, Wago. Her hair was combed perfectly, though dry and thinning out in some places where her hairline sat. She called to me with the silence that flowed from her half-open mouth of parted teeth, with the smell of her rotting organs shouting out into the room. Like the flick of a switch, I felt the warmth of urine run down my leg and soak into my jeans before puddling onto the floor beneath me. The girl that sat in the chair was definitely dead, and I kept telling myself that. She was dead, gone, deceased, never, ever coming back. The mirror against the wall that was home to several spider webs was angled enough to where my eyes met hers, but she didn't meet mine. One went off towards the somewhat ajar door that seemed to lead into another room, the other in my direction, practically staring into my soul. The rest of her face was sunken in and depressing so that I almost felt sorry for her, and not myself a selfish thing to say, I know. My eyes got back their moisture sheen of growing tears when Danny started slamming his fists down on the door to the outside of the room. His hits were hard and frantic, similar to the way my voice had been pounding in my throat. He screamed my name and cried with all he had, but I didn't budge. The hits got louder, and his screams grew into whines. Eventually the noise stopped, and there was a thud against the door. Danny had passed out on the other side. I came to know in the years after that Danny had witnessed something completely different than I had in the room on the left. The room on the right had been home to his worst fear. I only guessed at that because when I finally worked up the courage to walk out of the room, Danny was slumped against the wall, his arms out by his sides, and the front of his shirt covered in vomit. He must have made himself sick from all the crying he done out there trying to get my attention. Quietly, I walked out from the room and stared down the hallway. The rest of the doors were shut, just sitting there and waiting for someone to open them and discover another world of horrors. Again, I looked at Danny, but he was no longer there. His golden blonde hair wasn't golden blonde, but long, brown, and dry. His eyes weren't alive, but dead. His mouth was open and his teeth were spaced out, and I could smell his rotting organs from deep down in his abdomen. His hands were pale, a bouquet of flowers propped perfectly in them. He was dead, long dead. I watched a fly circle and land on one of the eyes that were stagnant and tinged with fluid from the inside. There was a scream that shook the house. I wasn't sure if it was mine, Danny's, or George's, but it was still there, flourishing and disrupting the soundless air from every nook and cranny. The thought ran after me when I went flying down the stairs to get away from that twitching arm, stumbling on the last few steps and falling onto the floor on my side. My ears rang for a short time after I jumped to my feet, clawing at the ground like an animal ready to hunt prey. My sprints were desperate in pace as I soared past the rancid kitchen, the knick-knack-filled living room, and the swinging door. I stopped when I reached the porch. The wind blew. In the front yard of the house, across the dirt road and on the edge of the tracks, stood George. His extremities were covered in bite marks, human bite marks, and he was completely unclothed. His hair, matted up with sweat, blood, and a clay-looking substance, didn't move from his forehead. His eyes were cold. His mouth was open. One of his hands started to twitch. Back in the house from upstairs, the music started up again. I'd never realized that it stopped. George, lovely, bloody, and bitten beyond anything I had ever seen previously in my life, looked at me dead in my eyes. His voice was raspy and forced. Like an elderly man's, he asked, have you heard about the tracks to nowhere? Story 7, Song of the Siren. This was not here yesterday, Richard thought to himself as he stepped on the bulge in the hardwood floor. He leaned forward onto his right foot, placing as much force as he could on the raised area to test if it would give beneath his weight. It did not budge no matter how much he bounced in place. He discovered the irregularity after spilling a cup of cold coffee that had been sitting on his living room table all day. He noticed how the puddle ran away from the raised spot, and while wiping up the mess, he could feel the small mound with his hand. Richard wasn't sure what had caused the deformation, but he thought it may have had something to do with the heating ductwork that ran against the bottom of the floor and the crawl space below, subjecting the woodwork to years of expansion and contraction. With the spill cleaned up, he went off to bed for the night and decided that he would just keep an eye on it to make sure it didn't progress. In the middle of the night, Richard was startled awake by a loud cracking sound. In the fog of sleep, he wasn't sure what he had heard, or if he had even heard anything at all, as opposed to having dreamt the sound. He lay there in the dark for several minutes, listening so intently that all he could hear was the ringing in his own ears. He managed to convince himself that the noise was just a byproduct of his dream state, and he was just about to drift back to sleep when the cracking sound came again. This time the sound was unmistakably real, and was a much longer and drawn-out splintering noise that ended abruptly in a loud pop, the sound of wood slowly bending until it breaks. "What was that?" Richard whispered as he bolted upright in the bed. He could tell that it was coming from the living room. It took several minutes before he worked up the courage to get out of bed and investigate the sound. He grabbed a baseball bat that was leaning against the wall in his closet and headed through the bedroom door. "Who's in here?" he said loudly as he switched on the hallway light. The hall was empty, and the house was silent. He slowly worked his way to the living room and turned on another light, baseball bat readied over his right shoulder. There was no intruder in the house, but he did find the source of the noise. The bulge in the wood floor had grown, so much so that it had splintered and cracked. Richard cautiously stepped toward the mound. The bulge was now about 4 inches high by his best estimation, and the planks had produced a series of jagged shards at opposing angles where the separation occurred. Realizing there was no one else in the house, he let his guard down and leaned the bat up against the wall. He approached the cracked boards and stood over them. They were not separated enough to see through the subfloor. Richard puzzled over what could possibly be beneath the surface that would cause this. He glanced up at the clock. 3:43. Well, it's going to have to wait until tomorrow. There's no way I'm going into the crawl space tonight. Richard left all the lights on and retreated to his room, but did not sleep. He heard more creaking and groaning from under the house, as well as a few more pops in the living room floor. At the first sign of dawn, he got up to check the bulge again. The mound had grown to approximately 7 inches tall. The subfloor had begun to splinter and was coming through the finished hardwood planks. However, there was still not enough of a gap to see down below and determine what was causing the damage. As much as he dreaded doing so, Richard knew he had to go into the crawl space to investigate. At least by now daylight was breaking. The rusty metal door broke loose after several minutes of swearing and prying with a crowbar. Once free, Richard moved it aside and propped it against the house's concrete block foundation. He pointed his flashlight into the opening and switched it on. Richard hated having to go in there. He'd only been inside on 2 other occasions, once for a burst water pipe, and the other to kill a pesky colony of sugar ants that would not stop infiltrating his kitchen. The space was only about 15 inches high. Richard crouched down and panned the interior with the light. The area that was visible in front of him was just as he remembered it. The uneven dirt floor, the cinder block column spaced out every so often. He knew that in order to see what was under his living room, he was going to have to go inside about 20 feet and turn right. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly before dropping down onto his elbows and stomach to work his way inside. The musty smell nearly overcame him as he made his way toward the opposite wall of the foundation. There were a couple places where he strained to squeeze himself underneath ventilation ducts and water pipes that hung below the floorboards. The space darkened the deeper in he went, but there were occasional slivers of light from the foundation vents to help his navigation. Reaching the turn, he pulled himself forward enough for his line of sight to clear the corner of the concrete block wall, and he shone the flashlight into the space beneath his living room. Richard was surprised, yet relieved at the same time, when the beam of the flashlight exposed a tree forcing its way up against the floorboards. It appeared to be about 6 inches in diameter at the thickest part of its base. Branches that split off of the main trunk twisted and intertwined in a chaotic array as they pushed and strained against the subfloor. How on earth did this thing grow so fast? Richard wondered aloud. He surveyed the tree again, deciding what tools he would need to remove it. After putting together a mental list, he turned and began the slow journey back to the entrance. By late afternoon, he had taken care of the problem as best he could. Most of his time and effort was spent sawing through the trunk at its base with a hand saw. He then cut the tree into pieces small enough to remove through the access panel. Back inside the house, he laid a piece of plywood over the cracked floor and used his body weight to press it back down. The makeshift repair would be sufficient until he could call in a contractor to fix it properly. Lying in bed that night, just on the verge of drifting off to sleep, Richard heard another sound. This time it was not the splintering of wood, but rather a soft and velvety sound. He tilted his head and concentrated in the sound's direction. It was low and muffled, yet unmistakably present. It was as if someone, a female maybe, were humming a beautiful dirge, a song so somber and forlorn that one couldn't help but be attracted to it. The gradual shifts in tone reminded him of the ebb and flow of ocean waves. The sad song was mesmerizing to Richard. It evoked feelings in him of loneliness, of lost love, and even prompted a hint of childhood nostalgia. Did I leave the TV on? He wondered. He knew he had to search for the song's source, but was reluctant at first to leave the comfort of his bed. The song could easily have lulled him into sleep if not for its mysterious presence. He forced himself to throw the sheets off and step out into the hallway. The sweet sound of the ballad was stronger there, and even more so in the living room. Richard flipped on the light. The room was empty. The television was off. He worked his way over to the plywood covering his damaged floor. He slid it aside and knelt down to examine the cracked boards. The beautiful song continued from just below the broken floor and waves of vocals that made no sense in any language that Richard had ever heard. It was as if the voice was being used as an instrument in and of itself to mimic the parts of an orchestra. Richard was speechless, his jaw slacked open in disbelief. He leaned in closer to the crack and gently ran his fingers along the splintery seam. The song was melancholy yet soothing, and there was no doubt that it was coming from the crawl space below. Myriad scenarios ran through his head as to how this could be possible. Had he left the access panel off of the crawl space entrance? Even if so, why would someone go in there? And even if that happened, why would they start singing? The more he thought about it, the more frightened he became. The wall clock told him it was 11:52. The last thing he wanted was to have to enter the crawl space at this time of night. But in his mind, there was no other choice. He couldn't just ignore this and go back to bed, hoping the woman would go away. Reluctantly, Richard accepted the fact that he was going to have to investigate the singing under his house outside. Richard discovered that he had in fact remembered to replace the crawl-space door earlier. Not only was it in place, but it was latched from the outside as well. Upon removing the door, the song was much louder and more pronounced. As terrified as Richard was, the song seemed to call to him. It beckoned him and enticed him to come closer. In his mind he compared it to the sirens of Greek mythology. No wonder the ancient seafarers could not resist their call. He turned on the flashlight and assumed his crawling position on elbows and stomach. Without pausing to dwell on the situation for too long, he forced himself across the threshold and into the darkness. His nervous hands were shaky with the flashlight, which caused the light beam to illuminate his surroundings in brief flashes. A cinder-block column, a bank of dirty PVC pipes, ragged insulation drooping down from under the floorboards, the dirt floor with occasional spots of gravel. The song of the siren continued. Its volume was steady, but it appeared to increase the closer he moved to its source. There was no sign of any being in the space directly in front of him. Richard knew he would have to turn the corner to enter the area under his living room. Just as he approached the edge of the block wall which formed that corner, the singing suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. All Richard could hear were distant crickets and his own pulse throbbing inside his head. He inched forward toward the corner, his flashlight beam leading the way. In the instant that he was able to see around the corner, the beam of light picked up a small creature, thin and frail, huddled up on its side in a fetal position. It was the palest of white and appeared to be about the size of an average 2-year-old. The glimpse was very quick because Richard was so startled by the creature's appearance that he recoiled, hitting his head on a ventilation duct. He dropped the flashlight and it flickered out. "Ow!" he exclaimed from the pain on the back of his head. But his real concern was with whatever inhabited the darkness ahead. It had reacted to his yelling with a high-pitched shriek of its own. Then he heard the sound of movement as it scurried. Richard hoped it was moving away and not toward him. "Holy, what in the world?" he said in a hushed but panicked voice. Richard patted around until he found the flashlight and switched it back on. He frantically swept the beam left and right until he found the creature curled up in the corner furthest away. Its torso pulsated in and out as it took quick, heavy breaths. He noticed that his own breaths were much the same. The being was unlike anything Richard had ever seen before. Richard guessed that if he were to see the creature standing, it would be no more than 24 inches high. Even though it was small, it did not appear to be young. Its proportions were adult-like. The limbs were thin and wiry, with long, elegant fingers and toes at the ends. Its skin was so pale that it was practically translucent, exposing a network of purple veins beneath the surface. The head was small, but its eyes were grossly oversized and reflected shades of amber in the beam of light. The ears came to a fine point, almost like those of an elf. A patch of blonde hair originated from between the ears and swept down his neck and onto his shoulders. The creature whimpered and shivered while wedged as far into the corner as possible. Richard could tell that the being was just as afraid of him as he was of it. Unsure how to proceed, he finally managed to utter, "Hello." There was no response. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added. Still no response, only frightened shaking. "What are you?" he asked softly, more to himself than to the creature. "My tree," the creature said in a voice that confirmed its femininity. it's gone." Her voice reached Richard with a shimmering vibrato that tickled his ears and sent euphoria sweeping through his brain. "You speak English?" Richard asked, perplexed. "There's no way." "I can't get home," she said. "My tree is gone. You lived in that tree. I came through it, from my world." "And where is your world?" he asked below. Her voice was frail and shaky, as if just being present in this realm was slowly killing her. "I don't have much time. We don't survive long in this world. What can I do to help you?" "It's too late. My tree is gone. But there has to be a way for you to get back." Richard was dumbfounded that he was even having this conversation at all. "I'm too weak to dig on my own." A pause and a labored inhalation. "I can't breathe well." The tiny being closed her eyes, and within just a few moments the shaking and deep breathing ceased. Richard lay in the dirt, chest down, unable to believe what had just transpired. He grappled with thoughts of what he should do next. Nothing he could come up with seemed like a good option. He was too freaked out to pick up the dead creature and move it. But he just as surely did not want to leave it under his house either. He finally decided on a removal technique that did not involve touching the body directly. He left and came back with a shovel. He forced it into the dirt under the carcass, pried it up, and dragged the shovel out from the crawl space. He then gave her a proper burial in the corner of his property furthest from the house. He finished all of this at 3:15 a.m. Richard was unsettled for the rest of that night. He had showered and put on clean clothes only to lie in bed awake, thoroughly distressed about the situation he'd encountered. Tomorrow was a Monday, but he switched off his alarm clock and decided that he'd call in sick to work in the morning. So many thoughts ran through his head. What was that thing? Where did it come from? Are there others? She made it sound like there was an entire netherworld below the surface. Sleep did finally come to him, a deep sleep without dreams, without even the awareness of his own existence. The bright sunshine woke Richard, beaming through his bedroom window and causing a dull pain at the back of his eyes. His mouth was dry and his throat was sore. A wave of uneasiness swept over him as the events of last night came rushing back to the forefront of his mind. He debated with himself about whether or not he would tell anyone about the encounter. He had no proof without digging up the body, which he wasn't willing to do. And without that, everyone would just think he'd gone crazy. He got out of bed slowly and made his way to the kitchen for a glass of water. The drink felt cool and refreshing, and it soothed Richard's throat almost instantly. As he drank, he stared out the kitchen window into his backyard. He could see the mound of fresh dirt at the edge of his property about 50 feet away. A flock of blackbirds had landed near the makeshift gravesite and were scouring the land for bugs and worms. The silence was broken by soft, muted singing. The glass slipped from Richard's hand and shattered on the tile kitchen floor. He was frozen in both disbelief and terror. The song was without a doubt the same one that the little creature had serenaded him with yesterday, but this time it sounded slightly different. It had the depth and magnitude of multiple voices. Richard couldn't determine how many, 5, 10 more. The volume and intensity of the ethereal song increased. The voices appeared to have harmonious parts, some high, some low, making it even more irresistible with its gorgeous layers. The flock of blackbirds had noticed the song and were moving about frantically in the yard. They finally took flight with a great shriek, a dense group of black dots peppering the bright sky. Richard placed his hands over his ears and doubled over, clenching his teeth. "Stop it," he demanded. "Leave me alone." The song rose from beneath the floor. Richard had the overwhelming desire to get out of the house. Even though he was only wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, he bolted out the back door, off the porch, and into the yard. The song followed him. Realizing that he was not outrunning it, he stopped near the edge of his property and turned around. A multitude of the creatures stood before him, 30 or 40 of them. They were not advancing on him, just standing still, facing him. "What do you want from me?" Richard yelled. "You killed our pixie." One of them responded. Its voice had the same shimmering and mesmerizing quality that Richard had heard in the first one. "I didn't kill anybody," Richard said, breathing hard. "She got stuck here." "You closed her doorway," one of them called out. "Now there's no one to sing her parts," another added. The group of beings grew more and more upset. They each shouted their own condemnations and opinions at Richard. He was able to discern a few of their comments amidst the chaos. "Our song hasn't been the same without her," one shouted. "We can't stay here much longer," came another. Still others chimed in. "We need someone to replace her." "Him. Let's take him." Richard's instinct was to turn and run. If he could only evade them for a little while, they would all be dead soon due to whatever it was in this world that they were not compatible with. He tried to dart off into the open field behind his property, but the creatures were much faster than he'd anticipated. The first one grabbed his right pant leg, and another latched onto his left ankle. Richard was thrown off balance and tripped, landing flat on his chest. The swarm of creatures enveloped him. He felt them as they climbed onto his back, pulled his hair, and grabbed at his thighs and torso. The force of their grips was unexpectedly strong and painful. He heard his sweatpants tear, and one of them pinched hard on his buttock. The beings covered him and tugged his body in all directions. Richard screamed out in pain. The singing began again, as beautiful as ever, in the same way that the parts of the song came together. The creatures also began working together to pull Richard along the ground in a choreographed motion that suggested they'd done this before. Richard frantically grasped at blades of grass, which merely broke off in his fist as he was dragged on his chest. The song was so close and so loud that it felt as if it were emanating from inside him. With a wave of tugging, the beings managed to roll him over onto his back. The sun blinded him, and panic overtook him. He was no longer able to dig his fingers into the ground in this position. He swung his arms violently at the creatures, but whenever he knocked one away, there were others waiting to take its place. "I didn't kill her," he shouted. There was no response, only singing. "Let me go, I didn't do anything." His plea was in vain. It felt as if every square inch of his body was being fondled by a creature. They headed toward the crawl space, and Richard noticed that the door had already been removed. As they passed, he attempted to grab onto the side of the opening, but his fingertips slipped. The force of 30 or 40 beings was much too great to overcome. Under the house it was mostly dark, with the exception of what little light came in through the vents in the foundation. The dirt and gravel were rough on his back, adding more discomfort to the already agonizing tugging and pulling. Above him was a blur of wooden floor joists, mangled insulation, aluminum air ducts, and white PVC pipes. He reached out to grab at anything he could, but the vengeful creatures eventually took hold of both his hands. They turned the corner and headed to where the tree had been. The stump was gone, and in its place was a large hole about 3 feet in diameter. When they began to drag him down the hole, Richard attempted to wedge himself in by extending his legs and pressing his feet into the wall as hard as he could. The creatures continually broke him free. The song was deafening inside the confined space. There was barely enough room to breathe with all the beings pressed between him and the tunnel walls. The deeper they took Richard, the more faint he began to feel, until he finally lost all consciousness in the pitch-black depths